The cafeteria erupted in chaos as 17-year-old Marcus Chen watched the new principal walk through the double doors. Principal Sarah Martinez moved with an unmistakable military bearing, her shoulders squared and her gaze scanning the room, like she was surveying a battlefield. The whispers started immediately, rippling through the crowded lunch tables like wildfire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus couldn't help but smirk as he watched his classmates at Jefferson High School size up their new authority figure. At 5'6", with graying brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, Principal Martinez looked nothing like their previous principal, Mr. Henderson, who had been a gentle, grandfatherly type that students could easily manipulate. This woman was different. Everything about her screamed discipline and order, from her crisp navy blazer to the way she held her clipboard like a weapon. The trouble began during what should have been a routine morning assembly. Marcus sat in the third row of the gymnasium, bleachers surrounded by his usual crew of troublemakers. To his left sat Dylan Rodriguez, a stocky kid with a reputation for disrupting classes, and to his right was Chloe Patterson, whose sharp tongue had reduced more than one substitute teacher to tears. Behind them, Jake Sullivan cracked his knuckles loudly, a habit that had annoyed teachers for years. Principal Martinez stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it with the precision of someone accustomed to addressing troops. The gymnasium fell into an uneasy quiet, but Marcus could feel the tension building like electricity in the air. Students weren't used to this kind of authoritative presence, and he could sense the collective resistance forming among his peers. Her voice cut through the silence with military precision. She introduced herself as a former Marine Corps officer who had served 3 tours overseas before transitioning into education. She spoke about discipline, respect, and the high standards she intended to implement at Jefferson High. With each word, Marcus felt the atmosphere in the room shift from curious to hostile. Dylan leaned over and whispered loud enough for several rows to hear, "Great, we got ourselves a drill sergeant." A few snickers rippled through their section, and Marcus felt emboldened by the support. He had built his reputation at Jefferson, on being the guy who wasn't afraid to challenge authority, and he wasn't about to let some military wannabe change that. When Principal Martinez began outlining new policies about tardiness, dress code violations, and classroom behavior, Marcus exchanged meaningful glances with his friends. These rules were stricter than anything they had faced before. No more sliding into class 5 minutes late without consequences. No more baggy pants or exposed shoulders. No more talking back to teachers without facing serious repercussions. Chloe rolled her eyes dramatically and made an exaggerated saluting gesture, which sent Dylan into barely contained laughter. Jake tapped his foot against the bleacher in a mock military cadence, the rhythmic sound growing louder and more obvious. Other students began to notice their little rebellion, and Marcus felt the familiar rush of being the center of attention. As Principal Martinez continued her speech about accountability and consequences, Marcus decided to test the waters. He started a slow clap, supposedly showing appreciation for her words, but the sarcasm was unmistakable. The clapping spread through his section, becoming increasingly mocking and exaggerated. Some students whistled military-style calls, while others made sound effects that mimicked marching drills. Principal Martinez paused mid-sentence, her steel-gray eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto Marcus. For a moment, he felt a chill run down his spine, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside. He had stared down plenty of teachers and administrators before. This would be no different. She resumed her speech without acknowledging the disruption, but Marcus could see a muscle twitching in her jaw. He interpreted this as weakness, a sign that she was already losing control of the situation. Encouraged, he ramped up his efforts, making exaggerated military salutes whenever she mentioned discipline or structure. The assembly ended with Principal Martinez dismissing the students in what she called an orderly fashion, but chaos erupted. Anyway, as hundreds of teenagers rushed toward the exits, Marcus made sure to walk past the podium where she stood, offering a mock salute and saying loudly enough for others to hear, "Yes, ma'am, Sergeant Martinez! Ma'am!" His friends burst into laughter, and Marcus basked in the attention. Other students looked at him with a mixture of admiration and nervousness. He had just openly disrespected the new principal on her first day, and word would spread quickly through the school's social networks. By lunchtime, Marcus had become something of a legend. Students approached him throughout the morning, congratulating him on his boldness and sharing their own complaints about the new military-style rules. The story grew with each telling, with some claiming he had made the principal visibly angry, while others insisted she had looked ready to cry. Marcus found himself holding court in the cafeteria, surrounded by a growing audience of admirers. He embellished the story, describing how Principal Martinez had tried to intimidate him with her military stare, but had backed down when he refused to be cowed. He demonstrated his mocking salute for those who had missed it, earning fresh waves of laughter and applause. Dylan pulled out his phone and started recording as Marcus performed an impromptu impression of Principal Martinez, mimicking her rigid posture and authoritative tone. "Attention, students," he said in an exaggerated, commanding voice. "You will march to class in single-file lines, and anyone caught smiling will report for push-ups." The video was uploaded to social media within minutes, tagged with hashtags like Military Principal and Jefferson Rebellion. Comments poured in from students expressing their support for Marcus and their disdain for the new administration. Some shared stories about other schools with strict principals, while others offered suggestions for future pranks and acts of defiance. As the day progressed, Marcus noticed that other students were beginning to test the boundaries as well. In his afternoon English class, 3 students showed up 10 minutes late, citing traffic with obvious sarcasm. During biology, someone had written "Semper Fi" on the whiteboard in mock tribute to Principal Martinez's Marine background. The rebellious energy was spreading, and Marcus felt proud to have been the catalyst. His friend Chloe approached him after school with a gleam in her eye that usually meant trouble. She had been researching Principal Martinez online and discovered some interesting information about her military service. Apparently, she had been deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, earning several commendations for her leadership under pressure. But Chloe had also found some controversy surrounding budget cuts at her previous school district, where parents had complained about overly harsh disciplinary measures. Marcus saw opportunity in this information. If he could paint Principal Martinez as an inflexible authoritarian who didn't understand the needs of modern students, he might be able to rally enough opposition to force the school board to reconsider her appointment. It wouldn't be the first time student activism had influenced administrative decisions at Jefferson High. That evening, Marcus spent hours crafting social media posts designed to undermine Principal Martinez's credibility. He shared articles about military veterans struggling to adapt to civilian life, implying that she might not be psychologically fit for the job. He created memes comparing Jefferson High to a military boot camp, complete with images of students doing push-ups and marching in formation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Students, parents, and even some community members began commenting on the posts, expressing concerns about the direction the school was heading. Some parents worried that military-style discipline might be too harsh for their children, while others questioned whether Principal Martinez had the proper educational background to lead a high school. Marcus felt intoxicated by the power he wielded through social media. With just a few posts, he had managed to create a genuine controversy that was spiraling beyond the school walls. Local news websites picked up the story, framing it as a debate, over appropriate disciplinary measures in public education. Principal Martinez hadn't even completed her first week, and she was already facing significant public pressure. The next morning, Marcus arrived at school to find clusters of students discussing the overnight developments. Someone had printed out his memes and posted them on bulletin boards throughout the building. Teachers looked stressed and uncertain, clearly unsure how to handle the growing tension between the student body and the new administration. During first period, an announcement crackled over the intercom. Principal Martinez's voice, as steady and authoritative as ever, informed the school that she would be holding a special assembly at the end of the day to address recent concerns and misconceptions. Marcus felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly what he had been hoping for, a public forum where he could continue to challenge her authority in front of the entire school. Word spread quickly that this assembly would be a showdown between Principal Martinez and the student, resistance that Marcus had helped organize. Students began planning coordinated disruptions, from mass walkouts to organized chanting. Some talked about bringing signs protesting military-style education, while others suggested recording everything to share online. Marcus spent his lunch period strategizing with Dylan, Chloe, and Jake about how to maximize their impact during the assembly. They decided to sit in the front row where their actions would be most visible, and they planned specific moments to interrupt Principal Martinez's speech with questions and comments designed to embarrass her. Chloe had prepared a series of pointed questions about Principal Martinez's qualifications and her previous controversies. Dylan practiced his most disruptive behaviors, from loud yawning to exaggerated stretching. Jake planned to start a slow clap at inappropriate moments, while Marcus would serve as the ringleader, orchestrating their collective rebellion. As the final bell rang and students filed into the gymnasium for the assembly, Marcus felt confident that he was about to deliver the coup de grace to Principal Martinez's career at Jefferson High. The energy in the room was electric, with students buzzing about what was going to happen. Many had their phones ready to record, expecting to capture the moment when the new principal finally cracked under pressure. Marcus took his seat in the front row, flanked by his loyal crew. He looked around the gymnasium, seeing hundreds of faces filled with anticipation and excitement. Teachers lined the walls looking nervous, while a few parents had shown up after hearing about the controversy online. Even some school board members were present, their expressions grave and concerned. Principal Martinez entered through the side door, walking with the same measured precision that had marked her first appearance. She carried herself with complete confidence, showing no signs of stress or anxiety despite the obvious hostility in the room. Marcus studied her face, looking for cracks in her composure, but found none. She approached the microphone without any notes or prepared remarks, which Marcus found surprising. Most administrators would have come armed with carefully crafted speeches and legal talking points. Instead, Principal Martinez simply stood there for a moment, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled students with the patience of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than a room full of rebellious teenagers. Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty, but quickly pushed it aside. He had come too far to back down now. The entire school was watching, waiting to see if he would follow through on his promises to challenge the new principal. His reputation and social standing were on the line, and he couldn't afford to show weakness. Principal Martinez began to speak, her voice carrying easily through the gymnasium without any strain or amplification issues. She thanked the students for attending and acknowledged that there had been some misunderstandings about her background and intentions. She spoke calmly about her military service, explaining that her time in the Marines had taught her about leadership, responsibility, and the importance of creating environments where everyone could succeed. Marcus exchanged glances with Dylan, preparing to launch their first coordinated interruption, but something in Principal Martinez's tone gave him pause. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She wasn't speaking like a politician trying to save her career or an administrator reading from a script. She was talking to them like human beings, acknowledging their concerns while maintaining her authority. She addressed the social media posts directly, surprising Marcus by pulling out printed copies of his memes and comments. She held them up for the entire gymnasium to see, but instead of expressing anger or hurt, she smiled slightly and said that she appreciated the creativity and passion behind them. The gesture caught Marcus completely off guard, and he felt his carefully planned rhythm disrupted. Principal Martinez continued by sharing some of her own experiences as a young person, talking about times when she had felt misunderstood or unfairly treated by authority figures. She described her motivation for entering education after leaving the military, explaining that she wanted to create safe, structured environments where students could learn and grow without fear or chaos. Marcus realized that she was systematically dismantling every argument he had made against her, but she was doing it without attacking him personally or dismissing his concerns. Instead, she was acknowledging the validity of his feelings while providing context that reframed the entire situation. It was a masterful display of leadership that left him struggling to find his footing. As Principal Martinez continued her speech, Marcus began to notice details he had missed before. Her voice carried the weight of genuine experience, not just theoretical knowledge about education. When she talked about maintaining discipline, she wasn't speaking from a place of power hunger, but from an understanding of how chaos could derail young people's futures. Her military bearing wasn't about intimidation. It was about providing stability and consistency. The audience was responding differently than Marcus had expected. Instead of growing more agitated, students seemed to be actually listening. Some were nodding along with her points about the importance of structure and accountability. Others looked thoughtful rather than rebellious, as if they were considering her perspective for the first time. Marcus felt his confidence beginning to waver, but he knew he had to act before Principal Martinez completely won over the crowd. He had promised his followers a confrontation, and they were counting on him to deliver. Taking a deep breath, he prepared to stand up and launch the challenge that would define his entire high school career and Principal Martinez's tenure at Jefferson High. The gymnasium fell silent as Principal Martinez paused in her speech, her eyes once again finding Marcus in the front row. This time, instead of feeling intimidated, he felt something else entirely, the sense that he was about to make a decision that would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone in that room. The next 30 seconds would determine whether he was truly the leader he claimed to be, or just another student who had mistaken loudness for strength. Marcus could feel hundreds of eyes on him as he prepared to stand, knowing that whatever happened next would echo through the halls of Jefferson High for years to come. Principal Martinez waited patiently, her expression neither challenging nor dismissive, but rather expectant, as if she knew something about this moment that he didn't yet understand. The weight of anticipation filled the air as Marcus gathered himself for what he believed would be his defining moment, unaware that Principal Martinez had been preparing for this exact scenario since the moment she accepted the position at Jefferson High. Her military training had taught her to anticipate challenges and prepare multiple responses, and she had been quietly observing and analyzing the student dynamics since her first day on campus. Marcus stood slowly, feeling the energy in the room shift as all attention focused on him. This was it, the moment he had been building toward since Principal Martinez first walked through those cafeteria doors. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to deliver the challenge that would cement his status as the leader of student resistance, completely unaware that he was about to encounter something far more powerful than military authority, genuine leadership backed by unshakable conviction and hard-earned wisdom. Marcus rose from his seat with deliberate slowness, savoring what he believed would be his moment of triumph. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere that amplified every small sound. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel the collective breath of 400 students waiting to see what would happen next. Principal Martinez stood at the podium with her hands clasped behind her back, watching Marcus, with an expression of calm patience that he found infuriating. She didn't look nervous or defensive, which wasn't the reaction he had expected. Most adults, when confronted by a student in front of a large audience, showed some sign of discomfort or anxiety. But Principal Martinez looked like she was waiting for something interesting to happen, rather than dreading a public confrontation. Marcus cleared his throat, a sound that echoed through the silent gymnasium like a gunshot. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his head, planning exactly what he would say to expose Principal Martinez as an authoritarian figure who had no business running a high school. He had prepared statistics about student mental health under strict disciplinary systems, had researched complaints from her previous school, and had crafted arguments about the difference between military personnel and civilian teenagers. Principal Martinez, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, I think a lot of us have some serious concerns about the direction this school is heading. He gestured broadly at the assembled students, many of whom nodded in agreement. We're not soldiers, and this isn't a military base. We're students who deserve to be treated with respect, not barked at like recruits. A murmur of approval rippled through portions of the audience, and Marcus felt his confidence surge. This was going exactly as he had planned. He was speaking truth to power, standing up for student rights, and doing it in front of witnesses who could spread the word about his courage. Social media would be buzzing within minutes, and by tomorrow morning, his confrontation would be the talk of the entire district. Principal Martinez nodded slowly, as if genuinely considering his words. Thank you for sharing your concerns, Marcus, she said, and he was surprised that she knew his name. You're absolutely right that this isn't a military base, and you're not soldiers, but I'm curious about something. What do you think the purpose of discipline is in a school environment? The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected her to defend her policies or dismiss his concerns, not turn the conversation into what felt like a classroom discussion. He glanced at Dylan and Chloe, who looked equally confused by the unexpected direction of the exchange. Discipline is supposed to help students learn, Marcus replied cautiously, sensing a trap but unable to identify it. But there's a difference between reasonable rules and treating people like they're in boot camp. I completely agree, Principal Martinez said, and Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him metaphorically. So let me ask you this. In your experience, at Jefferson High, how effective have the previous disciplinary approaches been at helping students learn? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. This wasn't the conversation he had planned to have. He had come prepared for a confrontation, not a philosophical debate about educational theory. He looked around the gymnasium, noting that students were leaning forward in their seats, genuinely interested in the exchange, rather than simply waiting for drama to unfold. The old system worked fine, Marcus said finally, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Jefferson High had struggled with chronic problems for years. Students regularly skipped classes without consequences, academic performance had been declining steadily, and there had been several incidents of violence and vandalism that had gone largely unaddressed. Principal Martinez smiled slightly, and Marcus realized she knew exactly what he was thinking. Marcus, I've spent the last month reviewing Jefferson High's academic performance, attendance records, and disciplinary reports from the past 5 years. Would you like to know what I found? Before Marcus could respond, she continued, chronic absenteeism has increased by 40%. Academic achievement has dropped to the bottom quartile of the district. Last year alone, there were 67 documented incidents of bullying, 43 cases of vandalism, and 12 instances of violence serious enough to require police intervention. Does that sound like a system that was working fine? The numbers hit Marcus like physical blows. He had known that Jefferson High had problems, but hearing them laid out so starkly made him realize how serious the situation had become. Around him, he could see other students shifting uncomfortably as they processed the same information. But that doesn't mean we need military-style discipline, Marcus said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments earlier. There are other ways to address those problems without turning the school into a prison. You're absolutely right again, Principal Martinez said. Military discipline would be completely inappropriate for a high school. But what I'm implementing isn't military discipline, it's structure, consistency, and accountability. Let me give you an example. She stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to Marcus, with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. In the military, when someone breaks a rule, the consequence is immediate and often quite harsh. But in education, when someone breaks a rule, the goal isn't punishment for its own sake. The goal is to help that person understand why the rule exists and develop better decision-making skills. Marcus felt increasingly out of his depth. This wasn't the rigid authoritarian he had expected to face. Principal Martinez was speaking, thoughtfully and intelligently about complex issues, acknowledging his concerns while systematically dismantling his arguments with facts and logic rather than authority and intimidation. But you can't deny that your approach is much stricter than what we're used to, Marcus said, grasping for solid ground. Students are already complaining about the new policies, about feeling like they can't express themselves or make normal teenage mistakes. And those concerns are completely valid, Principal Martinez replied. Change is always difficult, especially when people are used to a certain way of doing things. But let me ask you something else, Marcus. Do you think the students at Jefferson High are less capable than students at other schools in the district? The question confused Marcus. No, of course not. We're just as smart and capable as anyone else. Then why should we accept lower standards for ourselves? Principal Martinez asked. Why should we be satisfied with higher dropout rates, lower test scores, and more violence than other schools? Don't our students deserve the same opportunities for success that students at higher performing schools have? Marcus felt the conversation slipping away from him entirely. Somehow, Principal Martinez had maneuvered him into a position where opposing her policies seemed like arguing against student success and opportunity. The audience was no longer just watching a confrontation between a rebellious student and an authoritarian principal. They were witnessing a discussion about what kind of school they wanted Jefferson High to be. Chloe stood up beside Marcus, clearly sensing that he needed support. But Principal Martinez, she said, a lot of students feel like you don't understand what it's like to be a teenager today. The pressure we face, the challenges we deal with. You're coming from a military background where everyone follows orders, without question. Principal Martinez turned her attention to Chloe with the same respectful focus she had given Marcus. That's a really important point, Chloe. And you're right that I don't fully understand what it's like to be a teenager in 2024. But I do understand what it's like to be responsible for the safety and success of young people under extremely difficult circumstances. She paused, and Marcus could see something shift in her expression. For the first time since the assembly began, Principal Martinez looked like she was making a personal decision about how much to reveal. "I spent 3 years in Afghanistan," she said quietly, leading a unit that included 18 and 19-year-olds who were barely older than you are now. My job was to keep them alive, help them grow into leaders, and ensure they could handle life or death situations with courage and wisdom. Do you know how I did that? The gymnasium was so quiet that Marcus could hear the heating system cycling, on and off. Students who had been restless and distracted were now completely focused on Principal Martinez's words. "I did it by setting clear expectations, providing consistent support, and never ever giving up on someone just because they made mistakes or faced challenges. I did it by treating every single person under my command with respect, while still maintaining the standards that would keep them alive and help them succeed." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. The woman standing in front of him wasn't the rigid authoritarian he had imagined. She was someone who had taken responsibility for young people in situations far more dangerous and challenging than anything at Jefferson High, and she had done it successfully. "But this isn't Afghanistan," Dylan called out from beside Marcus, though his voice lacked the mocking tone he had used earlier. "The stakes aren't that high here." Principal Martinez looked at Dylan with the same serious attention she had given Marcus and Chloe. "Aren't they, Dylan? What happens to students who don't graduate from high school? What are their chances of finding meaningful work, avoiding poverty, staying out of the criminal justice system? What happens to students who don't develop self-discipline, critical thinking skills, and the ability to work well with others?" She gestured toward the assembled students. "Every single person in this room is at a critical point in their lives. The habits you develop now, the standards you accept for yourselves, the way you learn to handle challenges and authority, all of that will shape your futures in ways you probably can't even imagine yet." Marcus realized that the entire dynamic of the assembly had changed. Students were no longer waiting for entertainment or drama. They were actually thinking about what Principal Martinez was saying, considering the implications of her words for their own lives and futures. "I know change is hard," Principal Martinez continued. "I know it's frustrating when someone new comes in and expects different things from you. But I'm not asking you to become soldiers. I'm asking you to become the best versions of yourselves." She turned back to Marcus specifically. "You stood up here today because you're a leader, Marcus. Other students look up to you, follow your example, listen to what you have to say. That's a significant responsibility. The question is, what kind of leader do you want to be?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Throughout this entire confrontation, he had been thinking of himself as a rebel, a fighter against unjust authority. But Principal Martinez was reframing his actions in terms of leadership and responsibility. She was challenging him to think about the impact of his choices on other people, not just on his own reputation and status. "I want to be the kind of leader who stands up for what's right," Marcus said slowly, though he was no longer entirely sure what that meant in this context. "Then we want the same thing," Principal Martinez said, "because standing up for what's right sometimes means challenging authority when it's truly unjust. But it also sometimes means supporting changes that might be difficult, but ultimately beneficial." Marcus looked around the gymnasium, seeing his classmates in a new light. These weren't just his audience or his followers. They were people whose lives could be affected by the choices he made and the positions he took. If he continued to oppose Principal Martinez based on his initial impressions and assumptions, was he helping them or hurting them? Jake stood up from the row behind Marcus, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked like genuine confusion. "So what are you asking from us?" he said. "Just to trust you and follow your rules without question?" "Not at all," Principal Martinez replied. "I'm asking you to give the new approaches a fair chance, to judge them based on their results rather than your initial assumptions. and I'm asking you to hold me accountable for creating an environment where you can succeed." She looked directly at Marcus again. "If the new policies aren't working, if they're genuinely harming students or preventing them from learning and growing, then I want you to speak up. But I want you to base your criticism on evidence and experience, not on fear of change or resistance to authority." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders in a way he had never experienced before. Principal Martinez wasn't trying to silence his voice or eliminate his influence. She was challenging him to use that voice and influence more thoughtfully and effectively. "What would that look like practically, Marcus asked, and he was surprised to realize that the question was genuine rather than confrontational. "It would look like giving the new attendance policies a month to see if they actually improve classroom learning. It would look like trying the new conflict resolution procedures before deciding they don't work. It would look like judging my leadership based on what actually happens to students at Jefferson High, rather than on preconceptions about military backgrounds." Principal Martinez stepped closer to Marcus, and instead of feeling intimidated, he found himself leaning forward to hear what she would say next. "And it would look like you continuing to be a voice for student concerns, but doing it in a way that's constructive rather than destructive. You have influence, Marcus. You can help make Jefferson High a better place for everyone, or you can help tear it down. The choice is yours." Marcus felt the eyes of the entire gymnasium on him, but the pressure was different now. Instead of expectation for entertainment or drama, he sensed that people were genuinely waiting to see what he would choose. Would he continue the rebellion he had started, based on assumptions and first impressions, or would he be willing to admit that the situation was more complex than he had initially understood? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and though it was probably only seconds, Marcus looked at Dylan, Chloe, and Jake, seeing uncertainty in their faces that mirrored his own feelings. They had come to this assembly expecting to witness his triumph over an authoritarian principal, but instead, they had all been challenged to think more deeply about leadership, responsibility, and what it really meant to advocate for student welfare. Principal Martinez waited patiently, not pushing for an immediate response, but clearly expecting Marcus to take the time he needed to make a thoughtful decision. The respect she was showing him in this moment felt more powerful than any punishment or threat could have been. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment and the significance of what he was about to say. Around him, 400 students waited to see what kind of leader he would choose to be, and whether he had the courage to admit that he might have been wrong about some things while still maintaining his commitment to advocating for his fellow students. The next words out of his mouth would define not only his own reputation and future at Jefferson High, but also set the tone for how the entire student body would respond to Principal Martinez's leadership. Marcus realized that this was exactly the kind of moment that Principal Martinez had probably faced countless times in Afghanistan. A moment when leadership meant making difficult choices based on principle rather than popularity, when doing the right thing required courage and wisdom rather than just defiance and bravado. As he prepared to speak, Marcus understood for the first time that true leadership wasn't about opposing authority for its own sake, but about carefully evaluating when to challenge and when to support, when to resist and when to collaborate. Principal Martinez had given him a masterclass in leadership without him even realizing it was happening, and now she was offering him the opportunity to demonstrate what he had learned. The gymnasium remained utterly silent as Marcus gathered his thoughts, knowing that whatever he said next would echo through the halls of Jefferson High for years to come and would either help Principal Martinez succeed in her mission to improve the school or make that mission significantly more difficult. The choice, as she had said, was entirely his. Marcus stood in the silence, feeling the weight of every gaze in the gymnasium pressing down on him like a physical force. The moment stretched endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity, as he wrestled with the realization that everything he thought he knew about this situation had been completely turned upside down. Principal Martinez had dismantled his rebellion, not with punishment or threats, but with logic, respect, and an uncomfortable dose of truth that left him questioning his own motivations. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been before, stripped of the bravado and performance that had characterized his earlier statements. "I think," he began slowly, "I think maybe I jumped to conclusions too quickly." The admission felt like swallowing glass, but he forced himself to continue. "I was so focused on opposing what I thought you represented that I didn't really listen to what you were actually saying." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Students had expected defiance or surrender, not thoughtful self-reflection. Principal Martinez nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and encouragement without seeming condescending. "That takes real courage, Marcus," she said, and there was nothing patronizing in her tone. "It's much easier to dig in and defend a position than to admit when new information changes your perspective. That's the kind of intellectual honesty that will serve you well in whatever you choose to do with your life." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "But I still have concerns," he said, finding his footing in this new dynamic. "And I think other students do too. How do we know that these new policies won't go too far? How do we have input in decisions that affect us?" Principal Martinez smiled, and for the first time since she had arrived at Jefferson High, it was a completely genuine expression of warmth rather than professional courtesy. "Now you're asking exactly the right questions," she said. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating systems where good questions can be asked and addressed constructively." She turned to address the entire gymnasium rather than just Marcus. "Here's what I propose. We establish a student leadership council with real authority to review policies, suggest modifications, and bring forward concerns. Not a rubber stamp committee, but an actual governing body with the power to influence decisions that affect student life." The suggestion sent a buzz of conversation through the assembled students. This was far more than any previous administration had offered. Student government at Jefferson High had traditionally been limited to planning dances and organizing fundraisers, not participating in actual policy decisions. Chloe raised her hand tentatively. "Who would be on this council? How would they be chosen?" "That would be up to you," Principal Martinez replied. "I'd suggest a combination of elected representatives and appointed positions based on specific skills or interests. The important thing is that the students themselves design the structure and selection process." Dylan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the confrontation began, stood up. "What kind of real authority are we talking about? The power to veto policies we don't like?" Principal Martinez considered the question seriously. "The power to review policies before they're implemented, to suggest alternatives, and to call for reconsideration of decisions that aren't working. Not unlimited veto power, because there are legal and safety requirements that can't be negotiated, but genuine influence over the day-to-day experience of students at Jefferson High." Marcus found himself genuinely intrigued by the possibilities. This was more than he had hoped to achieve through confrontation and rebellion. Principal Martinez was offering real partnership rather than just token participation in meaningless activities. "There's one more thing," Principal Martinez continued. "I want Marcus to chair the initial organizing committee for this council." The announcement caught Marcus completely off guard, and he stared at her in shock. "You've demonstrated that you can rally people around a cause, and that you're willing to challenge authority when you think it's necessary. Those are exactly the qualities this council will need. The gymnasium erupted in surprised chatter. Students looked back and forth between Marcus and Principal Martinez, trying to process this unexpected development. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift from public enemy to potential ally. "Why would you trust me with that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the murmur of conversations surrounding him. 15 minutes ago, I was trying to undermine your authority. Because 15 minutes ago, you cared enough about your fellow students to take a significant personal risk, Principal Martinez replied. You were willing to stand up in front of 400 people and challenge someone you perceived as a threat to student welfare. The fact that your initial assessment was incomplete doesn't negate the courage and leadership you demonstrated. Marcus felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, though he couldn't quite identify all the emotions that were overwhelming him. Relief, embarrassment, gratitude, and something that might have been hope all swirled together in a confusing mixture that left him struggling for words. Jake stood up from his seat, looking as stunned as Marcus felt. So, we're really going to have a say in how the school is run. This isn't just talk to calm us down? Principal Martinez's expression grew serious. I give you my word as a Marine and as an educator that this is not just talk. But I also want to be clear about something. Real influence comes with real responsibility. If you're going to help make decisions that affect everyone at Jefferson High, you need to be prepared to consider everyone's welfare, not just your own immediate preferences. She gestured toward the assembled students. That means thinking about how policies affect struggling students as well as high achievers, new students as well as those who have been here for years, students with different backgrounds, abilities, and challenges. Leadership means making hard choices based on what's best for the whole community, even when those choices aren't popular with everyone. Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Principal Martinez was offering. This wasn't just token student input or a way to placate opposition. She was proposing genuine, shared governance with all the challenges and responsibilities that entailed. When would this council start meeting? Marcus asked, surprised by his own eagerness to begin. As soon as you can organize it, Principal Martinez replied. I'd suggest starting with the organizing committee next week. Get a diverse group of students together, design the structure, figure out how to select representatives, and establish ground rules for how the council will operate. Chloe raised her hand again. What if we disagree with you about something fundamental? What if the council recommends something you really don't want to do? Principal Martinez was quiet for a moment, clearly giving the question the serious consideration it deserved. Then we'll have a difficult conversation about why we disagree, and we'll work together to find a solution that addresses the underlying concerns while still meeting our legal and educational obligations. I can't promise I'll always agree with the council's recommendations, but I can promise I'll take them seriously and explain my reasoning when we disagree. Marcus realized that Principal Martinez was offering something he had never experienced before: genuine respect from an authority figure. She wasn't treating students like children who needed to be managed and controlled, but like junior partners who were capable of contributing meaningfully to important decisions. The assembly was beginning to wind down, but the energy in the room had completely transformed. Instead of restless hostility, there was an atmosphere of possibility and engagement. Students were talking animatedly about the proposed council, suggesting names of classmates who should be involved, and discussing issues they wanted to address. Principal Martinez raised her hand for attention, and the gymnasium gradually quieted. Before we adjourn, I want to thank Marcus for his courage today, both in raising concerns and in being willing to listen to new information. That kind of intellectual honesty and leadership is exactly what Jefferson High needs. She looked directly at Marcus as she continued, I also want to apologize to all of you for not communicating better about my intentions and background when I first arrived. Change is always easier when people understand the reasoning behind it, and I should have done a better job of explaining my goals for this school. Marcus felt a flush of shame at the memory of his social media campaign and the assumptions he had made about Principal Martinez's motivations. She had just apologized to him and his classmates for communication failures, while he had actively worked to undermine her reputation based on nothing more than first impressions and prejudices. Principal Martinez, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. I owe you an apology too. I made assumptions about you based on your military background, and I organized opposition before giving you a fair chance. That wasn't leadership. That was just reaction based on fear and prejudice. The acknowledgement felt both humiliating and liberating. Marcus had never apologized publicly for anything before, and certainly not to an authority figure in front of his peers. But the relief of speaking honestly outweighed the embarrassment of admitting he had been wrong. Principal Martinez nodded graciously. Apology accepted, Marcus, and thank you for modeling the kind of accountability we want to see throughout Jefferson High. Making mistakes isn't a sign of weakness. Refusing to learn from them is. As students began filing out of the gymnasium, Marcus found himself surrounded by classmates who seemed to see him differently than they had an hour earlier. Instead of treating him like a hero for challenging authority, they were engaging with him as someone who might actually be able to help solve problems they all faced. Sarah Kim, a quiet junior who rarely spoke up in groups, approached Marcus hesitantly. Would you consider me for the organizing committee? I've been thinking about some changes to the schedule that might help students who have to work after school. Marcus was surprised to realize that he was genuinely interested in Sarah's ideas, not just in maintaining his own status as a student leader. Absolutely, he said. We'll need people who think about different perspectives and challenges. Over the next several minutes, Marcus found himself in impromptu conversations with students he had barely noticed before. Antonio Martinez wanted to discuss accommodations for students with learning disabilities. Jennifer Chen had ideas about improving communication between teachers and students. David Williams was interested in addressing the persistent problems with bullying and social exclusion. Each conversation reinforced Marcus's growing understanding that real leadership meant listening to and advocating for people beyond his immediate circle of friends. Principal Martinez's challenge to consider everyone's welfare wasn't just abstract moral philosophy, it was practical guidance for actually making Jefferson High a better place for all students. Dylan approached Marcus as the gymnasium was nearly empty. So are you really going to work with her? He asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested disappointment or betrayal. Marcus considered the question carefully. I think I'm going to work for us, he said finally. All of us. If Principal Martinez is willing to give students real influence over policies that affect us, then I want to make sure we use that influence wisely. Dylan looked skeptical. But what if this is all just manipulation? What if she's just trying to co-opt your leadership to make it easier to control the school? The possibility had occurred to Marcus, but his conversation with Principal Martinez had felt too genuine for that kind of calculated manipulation. Then we'll find out pretty quickly, Marcus said, and if that's what's happening, we'll deal with it. But if it's real, if she's actually offering us partnership instead of just token representation, then we'd be foolish to reject it just because we're afraid of being disappointed. Chloe joined their conversation looking thoughtful. I have to admit, she handled that whole confrontation better than I expected. She could have shut you down or had you suspended, but instead, she turned it into something constructive. Marcus nodded, still processing everything that had happened. I keep thinking about what she said about leadership, meaning making hard choices based on what's best for the whole community. That's not how I was thinking about student leadership before. Jake, who had been listening to their conversation, looked confused. So what does that mean practically? How do we make decisions that are good for everyone when everyone wants different things? It was exactly the kind of question that Principal Martinez had challenged them to grapple with, and Marcus realized he didn't have easy answers. I guess that's what we'll need to figure out, he said. How do we balance different needs and priorities? How do we make sure all voices are heard, not just the loudest ones? The complexity of the challenge was both daunting and exciting. Marcus had never thought about student leadership in these terms before. His previous approach had been much simpler. Identify what the majority of his friends wanted and then advocate for those positions as loudly and effectively as possible. Principal Martinez approached their small group as they prepared to leave the gymnasium. Marcus, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Marcus felt a flutter of nervousness, but he nodded and followed her to a quieter corner of the gymnasium. He wasn't sure what to expect from this private conversation. I wanted to thank you again for your honesty today, Principal Martinez said, and I wanted to ask you something. Are you really interested in this council idea, or are you just being polite? The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard, but he appreciated it. I'm really interested, he said. But I'm also kind of scared. I've never tried to lead something this important before, and I'm not sure I know how to consider everyone's needs the way you were talking about. Principal Martinez smiled. The fact that you're scared means you understand the responsibility involved. That's a good sign. And you don't have to figure it all out by yourself. That's why it's a council, not a dictatorship. She paused, studying Marcus's face. Can I give you some advice based on my experience leading people in challenging situations? Marcus nodded eagerly. The most important thing is to remember that your job isn't to have all the answers. Your job is to make sure all the important questions get asked and that everyone who will be affected by decisions has a chance to contribute to making them. When you don't know something, say so. When you make a mistake, own it and figure out how to do better next time. The advice felt both simple and profound. Marcus had been so focused on maintaining his image as someone who always had strong opinions and clear positions that he had never considered the possibility that admitting uncertainty might actually be a strength rather than a weakness. Principal Martinez, Marcus said hesitantly, I know I created problems for you with the social media stuff and the organizing opposition. Is there anything I can do to help repair that damage? Principal Martinez considered the question thoughtfully. Actually, yes. I think it would be helpful if you could post something explaining how your perspective changed today. Not because I'm asking you to, but because other students who weren't here might benefit from understanding that sometimes initial impressions can be incomplete. Marcus nodded immediately. I'll do that tonight, and I'll make sure people understand that I changed my mind because of what I learned, not because I was pressured or threatened. That would be very helpful, Principal Martinez said, but more importantly, it would be honest, and honesty is going to be crucial for the kind of leadership role you're taking on. As Marcus left the gymnasium, he felt like he was walking into a completely different life than the one he had been living that morning. The student who had stood up to challenge Principal Martinez based on assumptions and prejudices felt like a different person than the one who was now committed to working with her to improve Jefferson High for everyone. That evening, Marcus spent 2 hours crafting a social media post that explained what had happened during the assembly. He wrote about his initial misconceptions, about the questions Principal Martinez had asked that forced him to think more, deeply about student welfare and about his excitement for the possibilities created by the Student Leadership Council. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Students who had supported his earlier rebellion expressed confusion, disappointment, and even anger at what they saw as his capitulation to authority. But others praised his honesty and expressed interest in participating in the council. More importantly, several students who had never engaged with his previous posts reached out privately to share their own experiences and perspectives. Marcus began to understand how narrow his view of student concerns had been, and how much he had to learn about the diverse challenges facing his classmates. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into organizing the Student Leadership Council with an energy and focus that surprised even him. He conducted informal surveys to identify the issues students cared most about, researched how student government worked at other schools, and reached out to classmates he had never spoken with before to ensure diverse representation on the organizing committee. The process was more difficult than he had expected. Students had very different priorities and perspectives, and finding common ground required patience and compromise skills that Marcus had never needed to develop before. But Principal Martinez proved to be a valuable resource, offering guidance on group dynamics and decision-making processes without trying to control the outcomes. When the Student Leadership Council held its first official meeting 3 weeks later, Marcus looked around the conference room at the 12 students who had been selected to represent different constituencies within Jefferson High. The group included academic achievers and struggling students, athletes and artists, students from different cultural backgrounds and economic circumstances. Principal Martinez attended the meeting as an observer, sitting quietly in the back of the room, while the council established its ground rules and selected its initial priorities. Marcus was struck by how different her presence felt now compared to that first day in the cafeteria. Instead of feeling threatened by her authority, he felt supported by her experience and expertise. The council's first major decision involved revising the tardiness policy that had been one of the most controversial changes Principal Martinez had implemented. Through careful discussion and research, they developed a modified approach that maintained accountability while providing more flexibility for students facing genuine challenges like transportation issues or family responsibilities. When Marcus presented the council's recommendation to Principal Martinez, he was nervous about how she would respond. The revised policy was significantly different from what she had originally proposed, and he wasn't sure whether she would view the changes as improvements or compromises that weakened necessary standards. Principal Martinez studied the proposal carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the reasoning behind specific provisions and the anticipated impact on different student populations. After a thorough discussion, she approved the revised policy, with minor modifications to address legal requirements. "This is exactly what I hoped the council would produce," she told Marcus after the meeting. "A policy that maintains high standards while being responsive to the real challenges students face. You've done excellent work." The success of their first major initiative gave Marcus and the other council members confidence to tackle more and complex issues. Over the following months, they addressed everything from academic support programs to conflict resolution procedures to improvements in school facilities and resources. Not every initiative was successful, and the council had to navigate disagreements both within their own membership and with the broader student body. Marcus learned that leadership often meant making difficult decisions that disappointed some people while serving the greater good of the school community. But the cumulative impact of the council's work was undeniable. Academic performance at Jefferson High began to improve as students became more engaged in their education. Disciplinary Problems decreased as students felt more ownership in the school's culture and policies. Most importantly, the adversarial relationship between students and administration that had characterized previous years was replaced by genuine collaboration and mutual respect. Marcus's own transformation was perhaps the most dramatic change of all. The student who had once defined himself primarily through opposition to authority discovered that he was far more effective as a bridge builder and problem solver. His natural charisma and communication skills, which he had previously used mainly for entertainment and rebellion, became tools for bringing different groups together and advocating for constructive solutions. By the end of his junior year, Marcus had been elected student body president in the most competitive race in Jefferson High's history. His campaign focused not on promises to fight the administration, but on expanding the partnership between students and school leadership that had begun with the Student Leadership Council. Principal Martinez attended Marcus's inauguration as student body president, and her remarks during the ceremony reflected the journey they had both taken since that confrontational day in the gymnasium. "When I first met Marcus," she said, "he challenged me to prove that I deserved the trust and respect of Jefferson High's students. Today, he has proven that he deserves the trust and respect of his fellow students through his commitment to service, his intellectual honesty, and his ability to bring people together around common goals." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "But more than that, he has taught me valuable lessons about leadership, about the importance of listening before acting, and about the strength that comes from admitting when you've been wrong. The partnership we've built together has made Jefferson High a better place for everyone, and I'm grateful for the courage he showed in challenging me to be a better leader." Marcus felt tears in his eyes as he listened to Principal Martinez's words. The journey from antagonist to ally had been more challenging and rewarding than anything he had experienced before. He had discovered that true leadership wasn't about having power over others, but about using whatever influence he had to serve something larger than himself. In his own remarks, as the newly inaugurated student body president, Marcus reflected on the lessons he had learned about courage, responsibility, and the difference between reacting to change and leading it. "A year ago," he said, "I thought leadership meant standing up to authority and fighting for what I wanted. Today, I understand that leadership means listening to different perspectives, building consensus around shared values, and having the courage to change your mind when you learn new information." He looked out at the assembled students, many of whom had supported his initial rebellion against Principal Martinez and had followed his journey toward partnership and collaboration. "The most important thing I've learned is that we can achieve more by working with people than by working against them. That doesn't mean accepting everything without question, but it means approaching disagreements with curiosity instead of hostility, and being willing to find solutions that serve everyone's interests." As the ceremony concluded and students filed out of the auditorium, Marcus caught Principal Martinez's eye and offered a small salute that was completely different in tone and meaning from the mocking gesture he had made during their first encounter. This salute was genuine recognition of her leadership and gratitude for the opportunities she had created for him to grow and develop his own leadership skills. Principal Martinez returned the salute with a smile that conveyed pride, respect, and hope for the continued partnership that would shape Jefferson High's future. The transformation that had begun with a confrontation in the gymnasium had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined, a model for how young people and adults could work together to create positive change in their community. Years later, when Marcus was asked to speak to new student leaders about effective advocacy and leadership, he would always return to that moment in the gymnasium when Principal Martinez had challenged him to consider what kind of leader he wanted. to be. The 30 seconds that had felt like a complete defeat at the time had actually been the beginning of the most important learning experience of his life. The story of Marcus and Principal Martinez became legendary at Jefferson High, passed down through generations of students as an example of how conflict could be transformed into collaboration, how assumptions could be challenged by open dialogue, and how true leadership emerged not from the loudest voice or the strongest opposition, but from the courage to listen, learn, and grow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.